Hi everybody, and welcome to the first live session of the CSR and Value Creation MOOC. So today we are going to discuss all the questions you have raised in the discussion forums, and we have with us Céline Louche, and we have also Iordanis Kalaitzoglou and André Sobczak. In terms of the live session, it will be about 45 minutes to 1 hour. You can ask all your questions on the, you have a chat, how do you call that? Live chat on the YouTube, and so you can ask all your questions there, and we will reply to your questions. But first, Iordanis, André, and I will just give you a brief summary of everything what has been discussed in the discussion forums. So it will take us about 30 minutes maximum, and then we go to your questions. So please do not hesitate to ask all your questions. We are here today with you to answer your questions, to have a live session. Also, it's a written and live session, but we are here really to address all your questions and see where we can add value to this MOOC. So something else, yes. So the structure of this live session will be 30 minutes. We will be presenting the summarizing what has happened. Then we will have some Q&A session between you and us. And then we have a closing, very summary of what has happened during this live session. So let's start with one of the threads, which is about the proactive companies, the CSR proactive companies. So it has been quite a lively discussion on the forum, and lots of good points. So what was very interesting is that you came up with lots of examples of companies from all over the world, from India, from France, from the US, from Germany, from Bangladesh. So many companies from many sectors, many countries, and also the reasons why you came up with those companies the reasons were very diverse. So that was also very interesting to see that some of you presented some companies as very proactive because they were highly engaged with the local community. For others, the proactive companies was because they were highly engaged with their employees. And for others was because of the type of products they were developing. So the reasons why you saw those companies proactive was very different from the different comments I could read. But one interesting question that came up was, but what is a good CSR performing company? What is it exactly? Is it a company which has lots of CSR initiatives, but which is not taking into account CSR in the development of its product? It was, for example, about Coca-Cola. So yes, they have lots of initiatives around CSR, but what about the product itself? So can we say that Coca-Cola is a good CSR performing company? But also some of you also raised the question of Standins. So yes, Nestle, Apple are very good. They are doing lots of things around CSR, around the environment, or around social issues. But all of those companies have also, they have their own scandals. So can we say that those companies are good CSR performing companies? And I think that those are very good comments because it's very difficult to define what is a proactive CSR company, what is a good CSR performing company. And there is no company is perfect. I think we have to acknowledge that even if they are doing a lot, no company is perfect. And it also raised a question about measurement. And others in the different comments, several of you have raised also the question, how do we measure CSR? How do we know about when is CSR creating value? I believe Iordanis will also discuss this point about value creation. But how do we measure CSR, and how do we know when CSR is creating value? And that's a very, very good point, and I think the companies and managers are struggling with that. How to measure CSR? We have taken part in a big project funded by the European Commission on trying to measure CSR impact. So impact on the company and impact on society. And we have seen that measurement is still far from being ready. We don't have yet the good measurements for understanding this notion of value. Also because a lot of value which is created through CSR is not easy to measure. we are talking about, as many of you have pointed out, it's about image and reputation, it's about customer loyalties, it's about intangible assets. So how do we measure that? How can we show that? So yes, so what is a good CSR performing company is a very interesting question, and I come back to that because what we understand as a good CSR performing company also varies from country to country. Varies because also depending on the context where we are and what we expect from companies. What we may expect here in France from a company may be very different from what we expect in India from a company. So again, what is a good CSR performing company depends where we are based. It depends about our norms and our values and our culture. And then a third point, which is also very important, one of you raised in the discussion forum, was the importance of integrating CSR into the culture of the company. As long as CSR is not integrated into the culture of the company, can we talk about strategic CSR? And I believe it's a very fair point. Yes, it's very important to integrate CSR into the culture of the company, so meaning that the employees also are engaged into all the CSR initiatives, all CSR discussions and decisions, that they are part of designing what is CSR for the company. It's engaging also stakeholders and external stakeholders into the CSR strategy. So yes, CSR needs to be part of the culture and needs to be part of the strategy of the company. Another point which was interesting, it's at some point in the discussion someone said, hey, we are talking about lots of large companies, the big companies like Apple, Nestle, Coca-Cola, but what about the small companies? Is CSR only for large companies, or is CSR also for SMEs, small and medium companies? And I'm glad this comment was raised, because although corporate social responsibilities, it's about corporate or large companies, CSR is also relevant and of importance for SMEs, small companies, even very small companies. And maybe I will ask André in a few minutes to say a few points on the importance of CSR for SMEs. Maybe a last point to finish my summary about what I have seen on the discussion thread on proactive CSR companies. And the last point, which was maybe missing in the discussion, is more about the tensions that CSR may create in the companies. Because it's difficult to make CSR strategic. It creates a number of tensions that we ought to recognize. It's about the tension between, should we be profitable? Should we take into account CSR? So there is a tension here, and Iordanis in his discussion thread has also raised this point. So how do we deal with these tensions, and where is these tensions, and how can we recombine those tensions, for example, between CSR and profit, between also exploration and exploitation, referring to March. It's about how can we exploit, how can we go further with what we have today, but also explore new strategy, new opportunities. It's also about, because CSR is about the sustainable development, so it's about the tension of the today and tomorrow. It's about the today, the short term and long term. And again, here is a tension. And again, when we come back, if I come back to the notion of measurements, often when stock quoted companies are very much into the short term and not looking at the long term. So here is a tension also that companies have to deal with when integrating CSR. And the last tension, which is interesting, is about selves and others. It's about the company, but also CSR is about the own company, but it's also about the other companies, and it's also about the society. So how to reconcile different interests. It's about the company and its stakeholders, and they may have different interests. So that didn't come up in the discussions, but around CSR, to integrate CSR, to make CSR strategic, there are lots of tensions that companies have to deal with. So now I would like to give the floor to André, which is sitting next to me.
Yes, thank you, Céline, and hello to everybody. I'm very glad to take part in this live session of this MOOC. It's also a very interesting experience for us as professors to be involved in this MOOC, because usually you meet the students in the classroom or in your office, but here now I have the possibility also to listen to my colleagues and to interact with you, the different students that are following this MOOC directly. And don't hesitate to continue to send us our questions, because we will also be ready, of course, to answer all the different difficulties you have met during the course or the new examples you want to bring in. I want to add something to what Céline just said about the diversity of the different CSR strategies we can meet in companies, and the examples you brought up on the discussion forum, which were indeed very interesting. Probably it's also linked to the fact that, as we said, CSR is very much linked to stakeholders, and so the stakeholders have very different expectations according to the different countries. And of course, the stakeholders are also very different from one company to the other. So even if you could imagine that companies, of course, have to decide on the kind of strategy they want to develop in the field of CSR, the strategy, even if you are very proactive, you also have to depend on what are the expectations of your different stakeholders. So this may also be one of the explanations that we can see so many different kinds of initiatives going on in companies. What is also interesting is to say that CSR is, of course, a learning process. So as Céline just said, no company can be perfect on all the different issues of CSR. And CSR is a little bit like a moving target. The more you are involved in CSR, the more your stakeholders are expecting from you. Sometimes the companies that have done already a lot of things in the field of CSR that are the most challenged by the different stakeholders, because they are used to have a good stakeholder dialogue, and stakeholders are, of course, expecting always more from companies, which is a difficult strategic challenge for companies, because sometimes you may have the feeling that it's a little bit unfair that some companies are doing nothing about CSR and nobody talks really about these companies because they just apply mandatory legislation, or even sometimes they don't meet the minimum standards defined by legislation. And you have others that have started to do something interesting in the field of CSR, and still it's not enough for certain stakeholders. So this is also a very interesting debate, I think. Céline mentioned the fact that some of you were mentioning the specific situation of SMEs. It's indeed something which is very important, and here at AUDENCIA we have created a research chair on CSR in SMEs, because we had the feeling that indeed SMEs are more and more challenged about their CSR performance, and they are asked to create value in this field. In many cases because they are suppliers from multinational companies, and these multinational companies, as you have mentioned in some of the examples, they're expecting that their suppliers comply with certain codes of conduct or norms that have been defined by the company itself, or the multinational company would expect their suppliers, who are SMEs, to be in line with certain CSR standards, such as ISO 14001 or the Global Compact, or so on. So it's indeed something which is becoming more and more important for SMEs as well. And personally, I think that the most innovative strategies in the field of CSR are happening actually in the field of SMEs. Probably because it's easier for an SME to be socially and environmentally responsible. In many cases, you say that CSR is too expensive or too time-consuming for SMEs, and it's true that SMEs have a lot of difficulties, and in many cases, the owners or the managers of these companies have a lot of things to do. But on the other hand, the number of stakeholders is also more limited for SMEs, and also the potential impact, and also thus the way how they could harm the environment or the society is, of course, more limited. And so the actions are also sometimes more direct. Once you have convinced the manager of an SME to make the necessary changes in the field of CSR, the management line is much shorter, so that you can have an immediate impact on the different employees. The employees see what the CEO is expecting from them, and you can feel the immediate impact. For example, job creation. If you think about an SME that recruits somebody, the employees can immediately see that this person is joining the company. If they make some change in order to improve the environmental impact, it's immediately visible for all of them. Whereas when you're in a multinational company, you have so many different production sites or plants where you offer services, that it's very difficult sometimes for the employees to measure what is the real impact of the company. So I'm not saying that all SMEs are responsible, of course, because you have to make the strategic choice to invest in this field. But once you do it, you can have very good results, and something which really is, in many cases, really embedded in the culture also of SMEs. And a last point I want to mention is about the discussion forum and the very interesting contributions you made about the role of public authorities in the field of CSR, which was one of the issues of the first week of the MOOC. And I was really happy to see your different inputs, showing really the diversity of initiatives that are going on or that are not going on in different parts of the world. First of all, there was a diversity of the different kinds of initiatives between some states that are very proactive in the field of CSR, such as France, but also India was a very interesting example, where they have a legislation making it mandatory for companies to spend a certain part of their turnover on CSR initiatives, which is something very different from France, but it's also quite interesting. And on the other hand, you have some countries, such as Nigeria, for example, which was mentioned by one of the participants, saying that there's a government that is not interested at all in CSR, which of course then creates a problem, because then you have to rely only on NGO and individual stakeholders to try to make companies change their behavior, or on international actors such as international organizations, NGOs, or the fact that some local companies are depending also on multinationals, which can get pressure in other countries, of course, as well. So a little bit like as for companies, states have also more or less integrated CSR in their strategy. I think that some states today have understood that CSR is really something which can help them to make good economic contribution, because if they have more responsible companies, these companies are also more performant from an economic and financial point of view, so they are also probably paying more taxes, and they are contributing also to job creation, of course. And the better their social and environmental policy is, the better also is the impact for the society and thus for the state. And as we know, states have less and less financial means to act themselves. It's very good to create synergies with companies. What also comes out from your different examples is the fact that public authorities can use very different tools. Some states use legislation, such as France or India. Others just create labels. I think this was the example of Mexico, where the government, in fact, decided to support some labels and to give the companies the opportunity to distinguish themselves from other companies which are less responsible, which is also a good way. So if you take the case of legislation, you are forcing all companies to change their behavior, whereas if you work with labels, it's just giving an advantage to those companies who are more proactive and integrate CSR in their strategy. And the last element was also that from some of your examples, you showed that you have different levels of public authorities who may interact, because some of you were mentioning international organizations or the European Union, for example. So even at the supranational level, you have some initiatives going on in the field of CSR. Then you have the national level, the state, of course, but also some of you mentioned regional governments or local governments that also can play an important role. And you may have, for example, cities that are also very committed in the field of CSR. And the Global Compact, for example, has created a network of cities that are very committed to CSR. So thank you again for the different contributions. And I think I will now hand over to Iordanis to give also some input about what has happened during his week.
Thank you, André. Hello, everybody. From my part too, it's a great fun for me to be part of this live session. I would like, first of all, I would like to encourage you to ask questions on the forum, because the purpose of this live session is, apart from highlighting the main points of discussion in the forums, is to cover anything that you might have missed, or it might be unclear from the videos themselves, the quizzes, or discussions in the forums. Anyway, I would like, from what we discussed this week number 2 about financial drivers, we moved from the initial discussion about examples of CSR and the theory around CSR to actually the theory of how CSR can create value. We definitely have issues of how do we measure the impact of CSR, how do we measure value, but before we make that step, we need to define what we mean by value. A very interesting question in the beginning of week number 2 was, do we really mean, when we say value, wealth of shareholders? Some people seem to be rather disappointed that this is exactly what we mean. CSR activities within the companies are projects, and as projects, they need some resources, and obviously they need to earn more than the resources. So the value creation function, that was the first thing we discussed during the week. We have the balance sheet. That was the element we started discussing. We have funds, these are the liabilities, and we have investments, which are the assets. So we get money, that it comes at a cost, and then we have some investments that they bring hopefully more than they cost. CSR is an investment like it's an investment on an intangible asset. We try to improve our profile. We try to appeal to stakeholders and potential customers. So a good project brings a lot more than it costs, and this increases the value of the assets. This extra value that is added on the intangible assets goes to equity. Equity is the part the funds we borrow issuing new stocks. So essentially, when we talk about value creation, we mean higher value of equity. And the natural question is, where can we buy equity? In the stock market. Who buys equity? Investors. So an indirect measure of how much value is created by any action within the company, whether it is responsible or not, is how much the share price increases by. We measure value by shareholders' wealth. Somebody else actually made a comment, what is responsible about that, or what is ethical about it? My response to this is that share prices include everything. When a firm appeals to customers, investors can see that, and they would be willing to pay more to buy a share. So the higher the share value, the more value lies within the firm. So if a company can create extra value by investing in CSR activities, investors could see that and would be willing to pay more. So the point is that we do not aim at increasing the share value, but just to create wealth for investors. We look at it from another point of view, is that when investors are willing to pay more in order to buy a share, that means that the company does something good. If customers, if stakeholders are very strong and require from the company to be responsible, a very good way to increase the value of the company is actually meeting the needs of the stakeholders and being more ethical, more responsible, or invest in CSR activities. Investors will see that and they will be willing to pay a higher price. So share price is a measure of how successful the company is. It's not that it is the target or something unethical or irresponsible when we try to maximize it. So that was the first point. My point of view is that it's not unethical. If people want companies to be ethical, companies will be ethical, and investors will be willing to pay a higher price for things that they are ethical. Now, to the point, CSR projects. That's my second point. Can they create actually value to the firm? One point that was raised in the forums is mainly from the last quiz, the last question of the last quiz. A CSR project, a responsible project, can create value when it brings more than it costs. But what happens when there are other competing projects that might be less responsible or less ethical? In that case, what a company should do? Obviously, all projects should bring more than they cost. But let's say that we have two competing projects, a responsible one and not so responsible one. If the responsible one brings 5% and the non-responsible one brings 15% returns at the same cost of money, and we choose the responsible one, we do not increase the value of the company as much as we could. Investors can see that, so the price they are willing to pay is not that much. So in order for a company to choose and choose a CSR project in order to create value, this project needs to be really valuable to the stakeholders of the company, to the people who are related with the company. If with this project they meet a lot better their needs, and the returns of that project can be a lot higher or relatively higher than the returns of other projects, then this is probably the optimal strategy for the firm. And now we come to the last point that I would like to discuss with you, which is the level of engagement. When do we really need to invest in CSR projects? An issue that was raised in the discussion forums was about the asset part of CSR and the liability aspect of it. Let me start with India, the example that Céline and André used before. All companies in India need now to reinvest in responsible investments 2% of their turnover. Everybody needs to do that. If you don't do it, probably you end up paying a fine. This is the meaning of liability. You need to meet some obligations. So if CSR is an obligation, and you need to take an action, if you don't, actually you lose value. So you need to do something in order not to lose value. If this is the point, the level of engagement is rather minimal, and what we can succeed in is to preserve value. However, we have some firms, some countries, and some firms that they are beyond national levels, that they want. What they try to achieve is to create value by investing in responsible investments. If they want to do that, the way that they can do it, the way that they can achieve their target, is by integrating CSR into their strategy. So the core of the business, the core of the firm strategy needs to be around responsibility. You cannot have a product, you cannot have some investments that they are ethical or responsible and have a product or a supply chain that is completely responsible. That probably will be contradicting. Stakeholders will not, the company will not meet the needs of the stakeholders. Investors will be able to see that, and they will not be willing to pay a higher price. So our measure of how successful an investment is will show that we cannot actually achieve the high as much as we could. Probably Céline and André would like to add more something more on the last point, because it's probably a lot closer on how you can integrate responsible investments in the core strategy of the business. I think that the point that was raised in the discussion forums is that if you meet compliance needs, you preserve value. However, if you want to create value, you really need to try hard. You need to become probably the leader in the market, or you need to be a lot better compared to everybody else? What do you think on that point?
Yeah, thank you, Iordanis. I think it's a very good point. And we have a question, but before answering the question, I follow up your point, Iordanis. And yes, it is very important to integrate CSR in the strategy of the company. And I can give you maybe a couple of examples of company. Just as in one of the company was mentioned in the discussion forum, which is Interface. It's about changing the whole business model to integrate CSR at the core of the business, not as something next to that you do little. You add. It's not you don't add some little things. No, you change your whole business model, your product, the way you design the product. Interface. It's about carpets, the carpets. So they have redesigned the product itself, the way they sell the product, and even it's not about selling products. It's about selling services. So how do you rethink your whole business, what you are doing to integrate CSR? So it's much more than just adding some initiatives here and there to try to engage with your local community. No, it's also about integrating CSR in the core business at the very strategic level, that all decisions are being taken, and that it's part of all decisions. And maybe an important point, it's about which I believe is very important to integrate, to go to strategic CSR, is to make CSR part of the vision, mission, and objectives of the company. As long as it has not reached this level, how can it be strategic? So sometimes companies said to be very responsible, but still CSR is not part of their mission or their vision, while CSR should help them to decide on the 5 or 10 years future. So I don't know, André, if you want to add something.
Yes, maybe I wanted to answer one of the questions that we got via the forum about CSR in SMEs and how challenging the implementation of CSR is for SMEs in terms of input cost and expert manpower that is required. I think that it depends very much on the economic sector you are talking about. Here at AUDENCIA, we're working with different SMEs in the food sector, for example, and some companies are in particular working in the organic food sector. And these companies have usually integrated, of course, the environmental aspects for many, many years, because they are selling organic food, and they are very strict on the different expectations from customers linked to the environmental dimension. But over the last years, they have understood that the same consumers that are interested in organic food are also interested in the overall CSR strategy of the company. And they see the fact that they have to invest in the social dimension and to really differentiate from other companies, not only on the product, but also the management itself and the culture of the company itself, as really a strategic advantage as to other companies that may have an approach where they sell organic food because it's something which is fashionable and there is clearly a market for it. So these companies have invested a lot in the social dimension and in the other dimensions of CSR, but it was almost natural for them, and even the employees in these companies were very open to these things. So it's very hard to measure whether there was really an effort made by the company to become more responsible, or whether it wasn't really the strategy of the company itself. And I have made a similar observation in company that works on infrastructures for cities that are building, for example, tramways for cities. There again, these companies started to integrate the environmental dimensions because they wanted to show cities that it's interesting to have public transport rather than only cars in the companies. So they have integrated the environmental dimension, but more and more they have noticed that in order to convince the local governments, they also had to integrate more the social dimension and say, for example, if you build a new public transport system in the city, you have to integrate the social dimension, for example, to make it accessible to also the poorer parts of the city, because there are most people that are going to use maybe the public transport system. But also in the construction, you will maybe have the opportunity to hire people with a few diplomas or that are excluded from the job market, because sometimes it's an opportunity to have a huge number of people working in the construction sector for this. So again, they had to integrate new dimensions of CSR, but they almost had no choice. If they wanted to continue to sell their products or their services, they really had to adapt to CSR. So today it's very hard for them to measure what is really the additional cost of being responsible, because it's just their business model that has changed. And on the other hand, you may have some companies that are in sectors that are very far away from CSR, for example, in industrial sector, where sometimes it may be more difficult for SMEs, because they really see environmental and social dimensions as an additional constraint in a situation where the economic competition is more and more tough, in particular in the industry sector. So they have more difficulties, but as Céline mentioned, these kind of companies, if they really want to create value via CSR, they have to probably go very far in integrating CSR. If it's just adding a little bit of social or environmental dimension, it's almost not interesting for them to do so, because then it will be very invisible to many of the stakeholders, and it will not be something which really creates value. So they have to go probably very far and to really to change the business model, maybe from moving from the industry sector to the service sector or other kinds of business models. So it depends very much on which sector you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just to add an example that you are going to see the last week of the MOOC, you will have an interview with someone from Ecover. But Ecover is also an interesting company which started as a very small company, which is now not an SME anymore, but also not a large company. And they have based their whole business around CSR, around sustainability. What do they sell? They sell cleaning products, I mean washing products, you know, shampoo, soap, washing products for washing your clothes. That's what they are selling. So they are competing against companies like Unilever, like Procter & Gamble. So those are large companies. They have their clients. So it's a very highly competitive sector. But this company, Ecover, started very small and just said, okay, we have green products. We want to protect the environment. And they have changed the way they are producing the products is environmentally friendly. They ask their customers to use their products in a way that they don't overuse the products, to be responsible in the way they are using their products, refilling their bottles instead of buying new bottles. So changing also consumers' behavior. It has been very difficult for the company to find a space on the market for their products, but now they have it and they are growing. I mean, it's a company which is growing a lot, which is changing. As I said, it's now becoming an international company. They are selling their products all over the world, and so they have clearly, thanks to CSR, sustainable development, they have built a competitive advantage, and now they are able to compete against the Procter & Gamble and Unilever type of companies. So I feel that here it has really added value, and yet it's a small company. But of course, they started when they founded the company, they started with the idea of building the company on CSR or around the concept of sustainable development. Now, what is more difficult is really when you have a company and at some point you say, well, now maybe I should integrate CSR. And yes, at that point, it's costly because you have to start with everything. You have to start with thinking about some systems to monitor your environmental impact, your social impact. So yes, you have to change the way you're producing your products, the way you are selling your products. So there is a it creates some cost from the company, and it's a big decision to say, now I'm going to make CSR strategy. Of course, it's easier when you start from saying CSR will be at the core of my business from the very, very beginning. Another example would be Innocent, a UK company selling the smoothie in the UK, everywhere in the world today. Again, they started with this idea of we want to be close to the farmers, we want to use local products which respect the environment, and they have found their markets, and that CSR is being built into their strategy from the very beginning. I don't know, Iordanis, on the question which was raised by one of the participants, do you want to add something?
I would like actually to add something on what you were saying just now, you and André, that one of the topics that emerged that emerged during the discussion in the discussion forum during week 2 is very close to what you were saying. Why a company should choose actually CSR? So the examples you mentioned, they focused on it and they made it their competitive advantage. But if you have another company that it might be more profitable to be cost efficient, then it might not be economically relevant for them to invest in CSR. Or if in some different sectors, like in the industry that André was describing before, that you need to try hard in order to be visible to stakeholders, then it might be cost inefficient, ineffective. So you might end up spending more than what you can get. So the why issue, why a company should choose this type of competitive advantage in order to outstand other companies in the sector, I think that's something that there is no clear answer yet, but it's up to the manager to decide. We think that this is the way that we can create a niche in the market and we can stand out. What is very relevant to what we're saying now is another point that somebody mentioned towards the end of the week, that it is very relevant to the moving target. Let's say I use the example of Starbucks with the fair trade. They were one of the first that introduced that in the UK. And customers saw this as value added in the product. So they were willing to pay a higher price. So Starbucks was a lot more competitive to other providers. However, everybody has done it very rapidly. That was this action, fair trade, was integrated in the coffee market very, very, very fast. Now everybody needs to buy coffee using this path, fair trade. If they don't do it, the only way that they can sell coffee is at a reduced price. Something that for Starbucks was an asset before, they were creating value by buying coffee using fair trade. It has become a liability for everybody. Now all companies they have an increased cost, and they need to do it that way in order to preserve value and not lose value. So I would like to combine these two points in the way that you use CSR in order to create value. You need innovation. You need to be innovative. Something that you start with now, it might be an asset, but if other people, if there are no high entry barriers in the market, and other people actually join, and they might even do it better than you. You need to be innovative in the firms need to be innovative in the process of integrating CSR and highlighting the advantages and the potential to the stakeholders. I think this is actually part of a main part of the effort that needs to be made when integrating CSR in the strategy of the firm.
And maybe to add a small point here. Yeah, and innovation is very key. I completely agree with you, Iordanis. Innovation is very important for CSR, but for the company in general. But what I think is very important is also a point that André raised. It's about how do we innovate, and the importance also to engage with stakeholders. And innovation processes, at least around CSR, happen very much with engaging with other stakeholders, because we need to understand the impact of the organization of the company on society. We need to understand what the society is expecting from the society and how to develop products and services that do respond to societal needs and that do not harm the society. So the stakeholder engagement process is very important here in terms of innovation, especially when we talk about, for example, about meeting the I can't find the words. When we go to developing countries, emerging markets, the bottom of the pyramid. Thank you, André. So when we talk about the bottom of the pyramid, and lots of companies do talk about, yes, we need to develop clear initiatives, or we need to be active at the bottom of the pyramid. It requires innovation for the products, for the way products are being sold, but of course it requires stakeholder engagement to develop products and services that are adapted to the population and that do not harm that do not harm the societies. Well, maybe you want to add something. We have another question here. How will CSR change business world in the near future? So is CSR going to change business in the near future? I mean, that's a good question. I don't know. That's difficult to answer. I don't want, and we have to be careful here. I said, CSR is not the solution to all the problems. CSR is it's not a tool because it offers many tools. It's a perspective. I believe it's a perspective. It helps, from my perspective, it should help companies to raise important and fundamental questions about what is the impact of my organization on society and how can I create more positive impacts and negative impacts. So it's here to make people think. It's not here to, it doesn't bring the solution. So is it going to change the business in the future? I think it has already started to change businesses, the way businesses think. I mean, when we think about climate change, it has a direct impact on businesses, whether they want it or not, because of legislation or because they see an opportunity, but it has a direct impact on the businesses and the way they function. I don't know, André, you want to add?
I think that CSR has the potential to change a lot in the business world concerning the stakeholder dimension, because we are really talking about a new kind of governance of companies. For many, many years in business schools and universities, we have taught students that managers have to take into account the interests of the owners of the company. And more we say that this kind of governance is probably not adapted to the new challenges we are meeting, and in particular to CSR, because we have to really involve the stakeholders in the whole decision-making process. So I think that we will see changes in the future about the employees being more involved in the definition of the strategy of the companies, maybe new kinds of business models where we have the social economy as well, that is in this kind of movement, but also maybe NGOs that could integrate some boards of companies, or at least be involved in stakeholder panels and so on. And also public authorities. Maybe there will be new relationships between public authorities and businesses again, and without being states, of course, owners of companies, but maybe a way of taking into account broader interests than just the interests of the shareholders. So I think there is a big potential, if we analyze CSR like this, as changing the governance of companies.
We have another question, and I'm now reading the question. It is a case of integration of CSR policy in all fields of the company. Then how would you consider the case of sales, price, MRP in MNCs like Coca-Cola, Nike, Pfizer, etc.? I don't know, Iordanis, do you feel like?
Actually, I was just about ready to add something to what André was saying, but
okay, follow the question and then we go to the next question.
Okay, good. I think that question, I'm very happy that somebody asked this kind of question, because it can only be answered from a personal point of view. I mean, what changes can we see in the future? My point of view is that we actually see the changes happening now. The fact that many companies try to integrate responsible investments, they try to appeal to stakeholders as being responsible, this is already a big change happening now. The way that future innovation will actually happen, and what other aspects of responsible investments we might see in the future, I don't see that we can. I don't think that somebody can foresee that, but I would like to add an example from what I'm working on, which is environmental finance. Globally, universally, governments have realized that there is an impact on of environment on actually everyday life. So they have agreed on trying to monitor that. They have made compulsory, at least for the majority of the countries, that the energy consumption that corresponds to emissions need to be regulated, need to be decreased. I think that we will see more examples like India's example more often in the future. Countries that they actually start regulating some industries either for environmental reasons or for ethical reasons. One example that I think that we will see in Europe is the Tobin tax rate. It's not 100% for ethical reasons, but many people, especially in the finance industry, they were challenging the notion of the bonuses that of the financial sector. So one way of controlling that is by making it more expensive, and one way of making it more expensive is the Tobin tax. It's a very controversial issue, but one of the fundamental thought about introducing it to the market, to financial transactions now, is that they try to monitor, to regulate investors' behavior. Another point that I think that we will see in the future is that, think of recycling. The notion of recycling was introduced in Western Europe the last 30 years, 40 years. Now it has become the standard. Everybody, all companies that they have packaging, they need to show that they do care about the environment. So if more people start caring about more things, companies, they will need to respond to this to these issues, and that becomes a liability for them. So if everybody requires no packaging at all, because customers think that this is the environmentally sustainable solution, firms, they will ask value maximizing entities, they will definitely find a way to sell their products according to customers' needs. So I think that we will see probably a lot more, a closer interplay between what customers and stakeholders require from the companies. Customers and stakeholders will be a lot more educated towards sustainability, and they will require a lot more. And companies, in an innovative way, they will respond to it in ways that we cannot probably foresee what exactly will happen, but there will be a closer interplay, I think.
I want to come back to the next question that was about the coherence of CSR strategies, and in fact the question that some multinational companies have very high margins, and you can question whether these high margins are compatible or not with CSR. Personally, I think, and again, like Iordanis said, it's more maybe about our personal ideas about CSR rather than to really based on research that we could answer these kinds of questions, but they are very interesting. Personally, I think that high margins are not contrary to CSR. What is for me important in the field of CSR is that companies try to integrate different expectations of stakeholders, and of course to have a positive social and environmental impact. And if this allows them also to earn a lot of money, it's not really an issue for me. I think we also have to be very pragmatic, and if we can convince companies that you can make money out of integrating social and environmental issues and replying to new expectations of stakeholders and new needs in this field, it can be a good thing, because it could be a win-win situation, even if it's not always the case, and even if, of course, CSR should not be limited to win-win situations. But if it's the case, it's not bad as such for me. And what is the real question for me would rather be how is the value created via CSR shared among the different stakeholders? It could become a problem if all the value goes only to the shareholders, as I explained before. But if we have high margins that allow, for example, to have better working conditions for the employees or better salaries for the employees, if this allows the company also to give something back to society and to have better partnerships with NGOs, it could be something good, and maybe customers also would be ready to pay a higher price than the actual cost of the product or the service.
Just to add on that, we should not forget that CSR is about how to find a balance between those three dimensions, which is about the social, economic, and environmental aspects. So how can we bring balance between those three dimensions here? So yes, here it's about how to make products and services accessible to all, but of course that means that companies need to have a margin. And I think it's I often get this question in the classroom when I teach on CSR, and people say, yeah, but if companies make money on CSR, it's not CSR anymore. And here, yeah, I mean, you can raise the question, but it's not about philanthropy. It's about integrating CSR in the strategy of the company. And if it's integrating the strategy of the company, of course, the company will make money out of CSR. And that's here the objective. How can we combine the core business of the company with CSR, not to make CSR purely something philanthropic, but to make it part of the business design of how do they make money, how they create value for the business and for society. So I think it's a very interesting question, and which is always highly debated, at least in the classroom. I don't know, Iordanis, if you want to add something?
It would be in the same line with what you are saying now. Firms are not philanthropic entities. They are value maximizing entities. Probably my view, it sounds a bit more cynical, but they will definitely try to make some profits. What we question here is, how do they make these profits? Do they make it in a way that is completely unsustainable in a certain view of profitability, or we can, stakeholders actually can put a pressure on these value maximizing entities to be a bit more responsible in the way they make their profits. They need a profit margin, otherwise they cannot actually sustain their business model. If profit margins are very thin, they cannot spend money on capital expenditures, which means that they don't have the luxury to innovate. If they want to innovate, they need some growth, and innovation comes from investments. So they do need margins. Now, the question of the size of the margin is exactly, I think, what you said is highly debatable. If customers want to spend money, if they see particular value on a product and they are willing to pay the price for it, the company always will sell to the maximum possible price. How ethical is that? Obviously, it's a very, very long debate, very long discussion. I think they will follow this approach. They will try to charge as much as they can. I think the debate is, what for? Is it something that is sustainable? Is it something that is ethical? I think that probably this should be the sort of discussion that we should be having in terms of CSR and profit margins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I mean, we are not going to enter into this debate, but there are lots of discussions around that. So but I think it's time now to wrap up this live session. I would like to thank you all for participating to this live session. The live session has been recorded and will be put on the website of the MOOC, so everybody can watch the live session whenever they want. If you want to watch the session, it's available. I would like now just to tell you to encourage you and stimulate you to go on the discussion threads, to ask questions. We are here, we look every day at what is being discussed on the discussion forum, so we are available for you, and we can answer when we can. Sometimes we can't answer your questions, but we can add some elements, because we have sometimes difficult questions. So I would just like to encourage you to continue to be very active on the discussion forum. Every week, new discussion thread will come up. But you also have an open forum. What does that mean, this open forum? If you have a point you want to raise, but it doesn't fit in any of the discussion forums which are open, you can always put your question here. So it's really open to all type of questions. So not about technical questions, but really much more about the contents. So once again, thank you very much to all. Thank you, Iordanis. Thank you, André.
Thank you.
And I wish you a very nice evening or morning or day. Bye bye, everybody.